my name is Imelda Maher, and I feel like I'm in outer space because I'm in the Smurfit School, because I am a professor up in the law school. So when I got this invitation about a month ago or thereabouts from Smurfit to come and speak at their alumni event, I thought, is it a spoof? Is this for real? So of course I said yes. So I'm delighted to be here. It's a bit of an experiment for me because I've not engaged with a business audience like this before, but I hope you find it of some interest at least. So we have, I'm delighted with my panel, who I'll introduce before the panel discussion so you know who's who, but the three musketeers are sitting over here. We'll bring them up once I'm finished speaking. They've seen my slides and they've okayed them, so I feel I'm on solid ground. And so the plan is I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. I can take immediate questions, you can interrupt, I don't mind. We'll bring up the panel, and I'm trying to set the scene, provide a context, what do we mean about globalization, what's this notion of multipolarity, what impact is it going to have for us? And then our panelists will have a kind of more specific insight, I think, around business, pharma and tech, and sustainability. So that's the contour of your afternoon that you have volunteered for. So I hope that goes okay. All right, lads, we're off. Right, so here are the four of us, which I've already talked about. So what do I want to do today? I want to talk about globalization and the shift towards multipolarity. And this will happen across, and I've put up this picture. This is a statue outside the law school over on the other campus, on the Belfield campus. And I rather like it because of its association with notions of globalization. It's called Judgment now, but when originally conceived by the sculptor who was Rowan Gillespie, he called it the eternal question. And it's two philosophers from east-west, roughly, having a discussion, which you can clearly see from the image. And this was his response to the invasion of Kuwait at the time, that we should talk, we should negotiate, we should engage with each other. So it was wonderful to see this be outside the law school, and it was actually donated to the school by Peter Sutherland, who, as you may know, was a European Commissioner. He was Director General at the WTO, and he was a UN Special Advisor on Migration at the end of his life. So we have a nice and the change of name is explained because Rowan Gillespie's grandfather sat on the first Irish Supreme Court as a judge. So it's something that's kind of deeply embedded within our sense of identity as an Irish nation on the one hand, but transcends that as well and encapsulates notions of globalization and transnationalism. So as you can tell, I rather like the statue. Go and have a look someday. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I've done my intros, a bit on globalization, multipolarity, a little bit on competitiveness, specifically the Draghi report, and then some preliminary conclusions. So I always like to say, what do we mean? What do we mean by globalization? It's a word much bandied about. So there are many definitions I've discovered preparing for this. I thought, which one do I take? Stiglitz is the safe one, if you like, because the Nobel Prize winner, fairly safe definition from his 2002 book, published just after the prize, where he says it's about the closer integration of peoples and countries of the world, which have been brought about by the enormous reduction of costs of transportation and communication and the breaking down of artificial barriers to the flow of goods, services, capital, knowledge, and to a lesser extent, people across borders. I'm reading that quote, I'm reminded of the tail end of the discussion in the last session, where we started talking about complacency. It's very easy when you enjoy these benefits, and I think that's reflected in the Brexit debate that we saw, that people become complacent about the opportunities and the privileges that they have in terms of free movement quite quickly. So what does globalization require? Well, a set of economic and political structures and processes deriving from the increasing structural differentiation of goods and assets. So where it's structures, we're referring to sets or patterns of constraints, patterns of opportunity, and processes are the dynamic patterns of interaction within that. So processes is the dynamic bit, structure is the framing, if you like. I always think of lawyers as operating within frameworks in this context. So what are the structures and processes that we're looking for? looking at transnational, moving across borders. Multinational is the notion, of course, of companies in particular being located in more than one state, subject to more than one jurisdiction. We're looking something that globalization means impact across states. So you have an impact beyond your own one state. And of course, more recently, especially in the context of the tech revolution, we're talking about actors with more autonomy than states. Although that's hardly new if we reflect back to the 18th century and the 19th century and the companies in parts of Asia that were almost more powerful than states at that time. In fact, globalization is hardly new as well. It's just taking a different form this time round, and was badly affected by World War I, which led to a retrenchment, something we probably need to bear in mind in the current climate. All right, so globalization requires these structures and processes, is driven by trade liberalization and by tech. And I think to state the obvious again, that no harm, scale matters. You need to be able to scale up in order to avail of this. So where do the lawyers fit in on this? Other than somebody on the wing said to me, well, you charge a lot. To which my response was, I read somewhere that lawyers are the most highly paid writers in the world. I hasten to add, I'm not a practitioner, so it doesn't apply to me. Academics famously write for free most of the time. Right, so why do we have international trade law then? Where do we fit into this structure, this globalization structure? We look for them partly because international trade laws in particular can shield long-term decision-making by governments, decision-making that goes beyond the electoral cycle, if you wish, so that it can act as a counterweight to vested short-term interests. International trade laws improve certainty, which is beloved of business, so I'm always told. It can set out common standards for public goods, the environment, public health being the two classic examples. It can increase shared regulatory standards, just look at your mobile phones, in order to increase efficiency, and equity. Now, I had a question mark after equity, and I took it off, because the trade laws would aspire to improving standards for everybody, but of course one of the challenges is whether this equity has been delivered or not. So how does international trade law, where is it articulated? It's articulated within the WTO, which followed the GATT agreement, so 1995 Marrakesh, but really these rules have been around since the post-World War II era. So what does the WTO do? If you look at any WTO textbook, it will be a minimum of 1,000 pages. But in essence, in a sentence, it's rules for trade in goods and services and on intellectual property protection. The 5 principles involved are non-discrimination, market access, no unfair trade, mainly addresses anti-dumping and subsidies. It seeks to achieve a balance between trade and public values, and it creates institutional frameworks to help realize these principles. And perhaps the most significant of these institutions are the dispute resolution procedures that we find. 166 members, you can only be a member if you're a state. What are their obligations? Their obligations are to take reasonable measures to comply with WTO law. The word reasonable is much beloved of lawyers because what does it mean is always open to discussion. In general, there might be some exceptions, so I just wanted to qualify that. Firms and people cannot rely on WTO law in their national courts or indeed in the European Court. So it's a law as between member states of the treaties, as opposed to creating rights or duties for individuals, be they legal persons being the individual or a firm. So we have this international law, so yet we're talking about a move away from globalization. How can that be? So can call it de-globalization or the new globalization. We'll start with de-globalization. And I'll deal with the law piece first, just because I've been talking about the WTO. I mentioned the dispute resolution system, which was generally seen as very successful. It had over 600 cases referred since 1995. But the question is, did it become a victim of its own success? Why? Because it had a successful dispute resolution mechanism. The risk was states were looking to litigate against each other rather than to sit down and negotiate a solution outside the parameters of formal legal frameworks. And maybe sometimes that might have been a better response, because if you litigate, you're in opposition by definition. And there have been various problems, but in effect, since 2017, the US government has ultimately blocked appointments to the WTO appellate body such that it can't function. So the dispute resolution system hasn't been around for the last while, which is a major... This is not to say the rules are not generally being complied with, but it's obviously there's no sanction or no mechanism in the legal framework to resolve disputes should they arise. So that's one kind of technical, but the ramifications are considerable, one step, if you like, towards globalization. The other is, of course, when you face crises. So 3 that we can highlight: the financial crisis back in 2008, I'm sorry to remind you, where we had weak growth, post-crash trade barriers increasing. We have COVID in 2020, not too long afterwards. Now, UNCTAD is suggesting this was even a more UNCTAD, the UN Committee on Trade and Development, that COVID was a more permanent shift, if you like, in attitudes towards or patterns of trade, because there was a re-evaluation of what constitutes risk, especially in relation to global value chains. And finally, geopolitics. I never know what that word means, but I'll use it anyway. Geopolitics, we can talk about the war in Ukraine, which has delayed trade recovery from COVID, because it was so close to the COVID experience, and has realigned trade routes again. And also, of course, the war in Gaza, though its trade impact is less conspicuous than that of Ukraine. Further deglobalization effects are protectionism. 2016, we see a US beginning its shift away from multilateral trade. We see tariffs increasing, in particular in relation to China, but also in relation to the EU. And we see an increasing invocation of the national security exception, especially in the US. 2023, we get the EU foreign subsidies regulation. I always think of this as in the EU, we have state aid rules. You're not meant to give aid except in very particular circumstances. If state aid rules are applying internally, European companies are then to be protected from other countries giving state aid to their companies. So there's a level playing field at the point of access to the European market. In essence, that's how I perceive the EU foreign subsidies regulation. In a similar vein, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the CBAM. This is, if you like, part of the Green Deal. There's an attempt to recalibrate goods coming into Europe to take account of the regulatory framework within Europe, which leans towards and in favor of the public good of the environment. But these can be seen as protectionist, depending what side of the fence you're standing on, of course. Trade restrictive measures are not uncommon. They're not new. That's the point I want to make. It's not as though nobody had any trade restriction measures until 2016. They've been with us for a very long time. But UNCTAD reminds us that 11% of G20 imports were subject to some sort of measure. And these measures were not old. They were introduced since 2009. So in a way, we're used to dealing with these issues. Maybe they've become more prevalent, or maybe it's become more acceptable to talk about them publicly, or one can be less diplomatic about them. But it's not as though they're new. So there may well be a toolbox as to how one can deal with them and how can respond to them. Of course, what's compounding issues is climate change, because the effects of climate change are most keenly affect those in developing economies who are least in a position to respond to them. Finally, unilateralism. So what are we seeing? Just to reflect on what's happened in 2025, we have new swinging US tariffs on goods coming from China, Canada, Mexico, and the steel tariffs were declared yesterday. It came into effect at midnight, I think, yesterday. I had to keep redoing this slide. So, it's a very volatile time. How long are the tariffs going to last? And I'm sure any business people in the audience will say it's very difficult to plan. How do we understand or make sense of this without, from a legal perspective at least, or a conceptual perspective? And I would argue that one way to think about this is not just to think about it over the last 6 months, but to take a longer timeline and to think about it in terms of multipolarity, which is often called the new globalization. So we have globalization, de-globalization, and now new globalization. And what do we understand by this term? So 2008, we're heading back towards. So 15 years this idea has been around. So this is not new things that are happening. They're just happening in a different way or more rapidly. So we can think of multipolarity as the emergence of a plurality of global actors who limit the power of the US superpower and that of other poles, such as the EU. And of course, now we could put China in there as well. We mightn't have put it in 2008, but we could now. And India doesn't feature. I don't know very much about India, but it's interesting that it wouldn't be in that mix. So this encapsulates the rise of the BRICS, if you like, China, India. Then 2008, we were talking about the resurgence of Russia. I've put another re in because who knows what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years in that regard. And of course, Brazil. It also encapsulates what we call the fourth industrial revolution of tech and AI. So what about tech in brief? So on the one hand, we have this multipolarity, this idea that there are many centres or several centres of power scattered across the world, of public power, if we think of it like that. But once we move into the private realm, and especially in relation to tech, we also have these superpowers who can transcend borders with alacrity, and who, as one of the boxes shows, I can't remember which one, who are actually bigger and more powerful and more dynamic than many state economies. At the same time, we have to be careful about this notion of globalization because there are limitations imposed. Look what might have happened to TikTok in the US. I tried to find out from my student son this morning, what's happened to TikTok in the US? Can you tell me quick? It'd be useful to know over the afternoon. But there's an uncertainty around the status of some of these companies on a national security basis in the US. And of course, access to some tech companies in China is limited similarly. We have a tolerance of tech bigness in the US, certainly in the pre-Con era. Head of the FTC who came in under Biden, now gone. It would be interesting to see what the direction of travel will be under the new presidency. The EU is seen as kind of at the forefront then. Well, if the Americans were comfortable with bigness, what was happening in Europe, and we have the toolkit, if you like, of the competition rules, and the Commission did deploy them with alacrity, I would say. The problem with the competition rules is that they're always backward-looking. You're looking at activity that has already occurred. And tech moves very quickly. So if you want to challenge conduct that's happened in the past, by the time you get to court, which could, a minimum of 5 years, if not longer, it almost doesn't matter because the business model has moved on. So there's a problem of looking backwards, and then if you're using the best lawyers, it can take a long time for things to wind their way through the system, and that's a problem. And the response ultimately from the Commission on that, which has been endorsed by the Council obviously, is the introduction of EU regulations on the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the AI Act, in order to allow so we no longer look back at what tech is going to do. Instead we say, well, we're interested in you, you're the gatekeepers, this is the DMA, and you're identified as gatekeepers, so now we will see what you're doing as you go along. So it's an attempt to look forward, because they can still look back, they can still apply the competition norms, but it may be it's seen as perhaps more effective to look forward under this new regime. So even if we see a reduction in trade, especially with these new tariffs coming in, I would say as trade slows, data flows. So there are constraints, but the data, it will keep moving. So this multipolarity raises this question of, are we looking at a new regionalism? And I just wanted to flag this. I went to a talk by a Chinese scholar based in the UK not so long ago on RECEP, and I didn't know anything about it, so I thought, gosh, I haven't. And it's not quite. It is up and running. It exists, but we have yet to see how it's going to play out. Set up in 2019, India withdrew from the negotiations in 2018, so it is no longer involved. It's the ASEAN, which is the Southeast Asian community, combined with 5 other countries, notably China, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. So these are big economies. It's an interesting combination of sort of not quite developed, but kind of late developed, fairly advanced, but still developing economies in some ways, or new economies, and also established economies. So it's 33% of world trade and 30% of the world population. It's larger in relation to GDP than the US. Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, about which we would hear more. It's larger than the EU. And the CPTPP is the Comprehensive Partnership Trade Pacific Agreement, and Mercosur. So this is potentially significant. Not so much in terms of tariffs, because they don't have too many tariffs, but if they try to challenge non-tariff barriers to trade, we could see something very interesting happening here. But of course, the original regional agreement is the EU. Unity, just to remind you, the basic principles: unity through diversity and peace through economics, in a nutshell. What does that look like? Just to remind you of methods: the single market, 1992. What's that? Free movement, again, we're back to that. Goods, services, capital, right of establishment, and competition law. Customs union, obviously, goods coming in, we're treated as a single entity. And then I often mention the directive to people, because as a lawyer, it's something I'm always interested in, and it's not necessarily something other people think about. It's a form of statute law, if you like, but it's not like a statute, because it's binding only as to outcome. You must get to this point. The norm is you get 2 years to get there as a member state. But the states then incorporate it into their domestic law in the way they think they see fit. So the law is adapted to local needs, subject to the European shape or the European policy that underpins it. And I think that leads to unity through diversity as a technique, almost better than anything else they do in Europe. It's a really clever legal technique that is used in the context of the EU. The other thing is we have a court whose decisions are binding. Like, the court was not busy when it was set up. There's a very famous article written by an American scholar that starts, far, far away in the fairy tale land, Duchy of Luxembourg, there is a court. And they could write like that, because at the time, the court wasn't really doing anything. And partly because it wasn't really causing any political waves, it was able to develop quite radical jurisprudence that has never really been challenged. And one of those really, there were 2 radical principles that it introduced. One is the doctrine of supremacy, of primacy, which says that EU law has primacy or is supreme over national law. And they don't put many qualifiers on it. The Germans, on the other hand, might have another take on that, but at European level, that is the position. And the second kind of radical doctrine they introduced is that of direct effect, which can get very technical, but in short, it's the last box. No, it's not there. The doctrine of direct effect says that an individual can rely on European law before their national courts. So you actually acquire a whole swathe of rights and powers as an individual when you're in the EU. You can bypass the state and invoke them before your national court. So it empowers the individual and gives you a court that is willing to make binding decisions. And the reality is that member states, by and large, comply with them. By and large, not always. And so the matter ends up before the European National Court. National Court's not sure what to do. It has a hotline to the European Court. It's a reference procedure it can use to ask questions. Okay, so how does this play out? There's a lot of deregulation in Europe through this principle of mutual recognition. The classic case is Cassis de Dijon. The French Cassis de Dijon had 17% alcohol. I've taught this so many times, I can remember the alcohol percentage, while the German Cassis had 23%. So of course, the German Cassis was more expensive, and they tried to restrict the importation of the French Cassis. It ends up before the European Court, and the European Court says mutual recognition. The French are not trying to poison anybody, or the percentage of alcohol is on the bottle. That's good enough. Labelling will cure the problem. You have to let in the French cassis. So the idea is that if the goods are lawfully produced in one member state, you can export them to another member state without constraint. That's massive deregulation going on. But you need to compensate for it, and hence you've got this idea of re-regulation then through European harmonization. REACH is the famous chemicals measure, medical devices, and we're back then to the digital stuff as well, among others. There are just a few examples. We have the competition rules. But the key principle is you meet European standards around health and safety. You often see the CE mark on toys. The Toys Directive is quite a famous one. Then goods should be free to move throughout Europe. So that got us so far. We still don't have a single market for services. It's restraints on capital. It's mainly worked around goods. And there is and also the notion is you can amend the treaties. We know here in Ireland, if we do, there's likely to be a referendum. Amending the treaties is now going to be very difficult. I think it's around 40, I think I can't remember, is it 41 or 42? It's around 40 parliamentary chambers will have to approve any major treaty change. And that's before you get to referendums. So, it is not an easy step to take. And I think a lot of the politicking you see in recent years is what can we achieve, what can we manage without having to go back and change the treaties. The EU has limited competence. It's not fully empowered, despite some claims. It's definitely limited in terms of competence. So one response is, last year we have Draghi. Central bankers seem to be getting a lot of work at the moment when they retire, between Draghi and now the Canadians have called forth. Right, we get his report on competitiveness. 3 aims. What's he suggesting that Europe needs to do? Needs to digitize and innovate, decarbonize, and interestingly increase defence capacity, even before we get to the current attempts at peace. Now, he does say, he doesn't devote too much time to this, but I want to flag it because I think it's important. None of this is possible without honouring what we would call the social contract. Easier when there are common enemies, I would say. More difficult when there are economic challenges. But one of the key weaknesses in the report really is that it assumes a massive injection of centralised public funds, without saying where they're going to come from. So, on the one hand, he points to prosperity, equity, freedom, peace, and democracy in a sustainable environment as European values. Now, actually, he's wrong. The word prosperity is not listed as a value. The values of the EU are in Article 2 of the TEU. Prosperity is not listed as a value, but he's put it in the report. So I thought that was interesting. Nonetheless, he says, how do we achieve these? Well, we need growth, more productivity, but we also need to preserve the values of equity and social inclusion. And how is that going to happen? We need radical change. And that's where he's looking at how he's looking at investment in particular, and investment in key sectors of the economy. The Commission took up this idea and introduced what they call the competitiveness compass. What do they want to do? 3 main aims. One is institutional, it's the bottom. They're introducing a competitiveness coordination forum, if you like, a tool where people will meet to discuss from the Commission and from member states. Regulation, we're back to regulation. Let's simplify. When I started my career way back in the 90s, I was writing about simplification of European regulation. It was a part of the agenda at that point as well. I suppose they're always looking to simplify. So I suppose I'm a bit, you always look to simplify, but I want to know what matter, what's the delivery here. The second point, I think this is a really interesting idea. I'd be interested to hear what the room thinks. They're going to introduce a 28th regulatory regime. So you don't have to comply with Irish law, or you don't comply with German law. You apply with the EU version. It'll sit on top or alongside all the national systems, and you can just plug into the European one as a more straightforward solution, rather than tailoring it to specific member states. So that might be quite interesting. Better access to investment capital, industrial policy. The competition lawyers are worried, really, when you see industrial policy flagged, but we get clean tech, decarbonisation, support for the car sector. we had the disaster around diesel has really cost the German car industry a lot. And any strategic sector essential to EU economic security. Take your pick, I think, on that. Main problem, they're not injecting lots of public funds. Why? Because the Recovery and Resilience Facility you maybe have heard of so far, like that's for 5 years post-COVID. The EU can do this on a temporary basis only under the treaty. It cannot do so permanently. So I don't know how they're going to work their way around this, but that would explain the constraint on this at the moment. Just done, conclusions. We could see multipolarity as just another way of thinking about regionalism. And the EU's been doing it for a long time, so I think we're well placed to exploit it. There are tensions and opportunities between regionalism and the ubiquity of tech and the tech sectors. The EU is facing familiar coordination challenges, but we have increasing geopolitical tensions. And that will actually, I think, help coordination. Where will we end up? We may well end up with the EU as a regulator, with the EUS as the tech innovator, which Draghi concedes. He says the boat has sailed for a lot of the tech innovation vis-a-vis the Europeans. And maybe China will be the disruptor. And I'm an academic, I always have to have a bibliography. Thank you. We'll move on then, I think, unless anyone has any burning question. We'll move on to the panel, who I'll introduce while they're bringing themselves up to take a seat. If I can get my iPad to work. Great, and I'll just introduce everybody alphabetically. Professor Susi Geiger is full professor of markets, organisation and society here at the UCD. Susi's expertise lies in questions of medical and digital markets, specifically questions of ethics and the common good. And she's interested in issues of pricing, patenting, access to medicines and access to data. She was recently appointed a member of the WHO Technical Advisory Group, on pharmaceutical pricing policies. Congrats, Susi. I didn't know that. And her work has been published in many highly ranked journals and policy outlets. That's the most important currency for an academic, is highly ranked journals, such as Organisation Studies, Economy and Society, Big Data and Society, and the Journal of Cultural Economy. Her latest book, and you heard it here first, is entitled Peak Pharma and will be published during the year by OUP. Advance orders welcome. And she's also got a co-edited volume came out this year called Market Studies, Mapping, Theorising and Impacting Market Action with Cambridge University Press. Secondly, we have Dr. Loretta O'Sullivan. Loretta, I don't know if you use your doctor in your professional life, but in universities we always like titles. Loretta is Chief Economist at EY Ireland, having previously been Chief Economist at the Bank of Ireland Group. And prior to moving to the private sector, Dr. O'Sullivan held senior positions at the Department of Finance and the Central Bank of Ireland, and was also seconded to the European Commission's Economic and Financial Affairs Directorate in Brussels. She has a doctorate in economics and a BA in economics and social studies from Trinity College. We are a broad church here in UCD, as well as an MA in policy management and government from the University of York. And finally, we have Professor Paul Walsh. Paul is Vice President of Education and Director of the SDG Academy at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He's on secondment from UCD for this, where here he remains a full professor of global affairs and sustainable futures and development. And he's also director of the UCD MSc in sustainable development in partnership with the SDG Academy. He is, I don't know where you get all the time, he's also president of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland. He has a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, and he has been a fellow in Brussels, Bonn, London, and Tanzania. And he's held academic positions in Trinity, Catholic University of Leuven, Harvard University and Columbia University, and has held other posts in the UN, the European Commission, the IMF, and the World Bank. His current focus is on sustainable development education, that is informed by science, practice, and policy. But most significantly, he has a master's from UCD in 1988 from the UCD School of Business. So he is the only alumni on the panel. Thank you. So I'm just going to, do any of you want to go first? Not particularly, we can take it alphabetically if you like. Do you want to go first then, Susi?
Right, okay. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for introducing me, Imelda. I'm delighted to be here, to be on this panel. And there's lots of things that I would love to talk to you about today. And one of them would be the whole sort of pharma angle, what it means for Ireland to have tariffs on pharmaceuticals, etc. But we're not going to talk about that. The other one would be to talk about what the demise of US aid actually means in African country, but that might be something that you engage with, Paul. So I'm not going to talk about that either. I want to talk about tech, and I want to talk about a certain ideology that I see behind a lot of the stuff that's going on in the US at the moment. And it's a very different kind of thinking around globalization than I think we're actually used to and that we're seeing. So that's what I want to talk about. And I want to pick up on something that you said at the end, Imelda, which is that at the moment, the EU, when it comes to tech, to digital, AI, etc., has the role of the sort of the master regulator. You know, we're at the forefront of AI regulation, etc. And the US is seen as the innovator, and China maybe as the disruptor. And when I hear sort of the words, you know, regulation, innovation, and disruption, I'm always reminded that these things are not necessarily separate. On the contrary, I believe that you actually need institutions, including regulation, to make disruption into innovation. There was a really good blog written by a medical historian, Mike McGee, a few weeks back. Disruption for the sake of disruption is not innovation. And he was reflecting on what Musk is doing with the US federal agencies at the moment, such as the FDA, USAID, NIH, etc. And I find that title, Disruption for Disruption's Sake, is not innovation, very apt in expressing my thinking around the larger picture of what I see happening in the US at the moment. And I think market reactions over the past few days have shown that what happens when you start disrupting institutions heavily is that markets get very nervous, businesses get very nervous. It's not a good thing. Okay. When Silicon Valley talks about disruption as a virtue in itself, they silence the fact that disruption a lot of the time needs to be integrated in institutional frameworks, in infrastructures. It needs to be framed, it needs to be scaffolded to become innovation. Okay? One of the big benefits that we still have in Europe is that by and large we still believe in the value of institutions. And this goes much beyond regulation as well. What we're seeing in the US at the moment, for me, is that institutions themselves are being disrupted. And when you start doing that, then you want to make very sure that you have something else that can act as a scaffold, as a framing of this disruption. So when you look at what's happening in tech or healthcare at the moment in the US, with Musk and his Doge in Washington, if they are dismantling institutions like the FDA or the National Institutes of Health or AI regulations, my immediate question then is, what are they trying to replace these institutions with? And in tech speak, the answer typically is data flows and data infrastructures. We're seeing companies such as Palantir, for instance, also with a CEO from the PayPal mafia, Peter Thiel, mafia, infiltrate themselves into state businesses, essential central state businesses such as security, healthcare, border controls, prisons, etc. And what they really are trying to do is to make the state essentially redundant. Musk is running Starlink in Ukraine, and that really should be, you know, I would be nervous if I was Ukraine military and I was reliant on, you know, some mad person like Musk. But anyway, So the idea of running the entire US state business on Bitcoin is part of that same kind of ilk of really thinking around this, replacing institutions with data infrastructures. So what we're dealing with here when we talk about how Musk disrupts state functions is sort of techno-feudalism that aims to make state functions simply obsolete, and with them all the transnational organizations that might stand in the free market's way. In the extreme, this leads to what some in the tech community call the network state, where essentially citizens are digital consumers that are free to choose their own nationality, so to speak, without being attached to a territory. You can, I quote here one of them, choose your nationality like you choose your broadband provider. Okay, now obviously that's only for the select few that can. But the idea behind that is that an internet community could come together, like, you know, people up to whatever 10 million people, to tokenize land through blockchain, buy that land, and then have the entire territory, so to speak, run on blockchain type contracts as well. So it would all be mutualized through blockchain. And Peter Thiel himself is building the Seasteading Institute at the moment, where he's trying to build a community of extraterritorial parts of the ocean where they can basically do what they want. I could go much deeper into this sort of tech, globalist, feudalist worldview, and I could talk about transhumanism and new eugenics and, you know, the singularity and artificial general intelligence, but that might take us too far down a very peculiar road. So I want to bring it back into our immediate concerns, and that's our relationships to institutions here in Europe. We need two things, in my opinion, and I really do believe that both of these are also reassuring for the stock market. We need to continue to believe in institutions. Institutions are based on belief, and they're based on buy-in. And then we also need to make sure that they can be financed to provide essential services such as, you know, healthcare, border control, security, etc. So when we think about that, you know, we had Palantir in the UK get huge NHS contracts at the same time as they got huge security contracts. We had Google DeepMind buy into NHS data flows for not a lot of money. Here in Ireland, we had a funky company called Genuity get 70 million from the Irish state to essentially draw up a Irish genome data set. Well, they got a whole load of public health buy-in. They sequenced a whole load of genomes, Irish genomes. Then they were sold to a Chinese company called Wuxi Nextcode, which then sold them on to a US-American company called Hibicel. At the moment, there's 10,000 genomes of Irish people who volunteered their data somewhere, probably in the States. We have no idea where. What we do know is that the Irish state got zilch for their 70 million, and the Irish population got nothing in return in terms of health benefit. We cannot allow this kind of state asset stripping any longer. We need to defend our institutions. We need to make sure that they are financed, that we're putting that money into public infrastructures rather than private companies, especially if these companies are datafied and are aiming towards this getting rid of state functions and replacing them through data infrastructures. So that's my run for the day.
Right, thank you. Gosh, I'll take a deep breath, I think, after that one. Will we run through the three sets of comments and then we'll pool discussion at the end? Yeah, I can see you're all kind of, yeah, everyone's kind of taking that one in. Loretta, would you like to reflect then?
Sure. So coming from my background, I'm maybe going to talk a little bit about how recent developments are playing out for the Irish economy, how we're thinking about them, and a little bit about the business mood around this and what business is looking for Ireland to do, for Europe to do in this context. So in an Irish context, obviously trade, FDI, membership of the EU, core planks of our industrial policy, been around for a long time, by and large, and you made the point about globalisation and equity, by and large, I'm going to say, have served us well, but the landscape we know has changed. And I mean, this isn't new. It is going back quite a period of time now where there have been shifts in terms of this. I usually have a graph where, you know, you can mark it out and you can look back and you can see that shifts have been happening, that uncertainty has been increasing in terms of the global economy. You can look at where we were in terms of the global financial crisis, follow that with the euro area sovereign debt crisis. Each time uncertainty is going up. We got to Brexit, we got to Trump 1.0 around the 2016, and we started having these conversations about protectionism and the increase in trade protectionism. Uncertainty rose again then in the wake of the COVID, in the wake of the pandemic. At the moment, it is at an all-time high. So it is really, really high, very, very marked. That global landscape and those material shifts, so it's increased protectionism, it's the re-emergence of interventionist industrial policies, it's also increased competition for FDI. So what we're seeing in the US at the moment and the outcome of the election and the shifts in the US tax and trade policy and how we might think about those, the dust hasn't settled in any which way, but in some way it's a crystallization of a new reality for the Irish economy, something that has been happening, and this has really laid it bare. So reaction, what do we do? It makes for a challenging environment. We know this. It's reinforced from a policy perspective a couple of things. The fact that we do need to look at Ireland's own competitiveness, and, you know, look around the room and people, you're old enough to remember the global financial crisis and the fact that we had to do huge amount of internal adjustment in the wake of the bailout, and we talked about these words around competitiveness and so on. They're very relevant again now. So we have to look at kind of how we position ourselves in terms of our incentives that we do offer here around R&D tax credits in particular, doubling down then on things like the go-to infrastructure delivery, the pieces around accelerating the green transition, training, upskilling the workforce, new technologies like AI. So these are all in the mix of things that we can do to help position ourselves better on the global stage as we go through this period of change and continue to go through this period of change. In EY, so we follow this for a long period of time, and we do surveys every year around Europe, including in Ireland, which is very much focused on having conversations with international investors and asking them a whole series of questions about why they look to invest in Europe, what are they thinking about, why they look to invest in Ireland, what we need to do, and so on. So our latest one of those for Ireland, this is 2024, so what comes through very strongly is businesses, international investors, decision makers are saying, you need to look at your high-tech industries and you need to look at innovation. So it's support around those pieces. Important. That's important. Similar messaging comes through when we ask about Europe more generally. What does Europe need to do? And it is that piece around high-tech industries, that piece around innovation. And businesses are quite clear on the priorities for Europe. It's very much you need to do more in terms of that fertile environment for innovation. You need to do more in terms of unlocking private investment. And this relevant in the context of the last couple of years where we've had the inflation shock, where we've had high interest rates, and where we're looking to the future and are in this transition phase around digital and green now, which is going to cost a lot of money. So companies are very much looking to financial markets. Are they liquid? Are they deep? Can we get the capital availability? There's been a big focus on that. So unlocking private investment, a key priority. That brings us to the long-standing piece in Europe around the Capital Markets Union, the somewhat relabeling of an element of that now as the Savings and Investment Union. So relevant, remain relevant. The other piece for business, no surprise for business on this one, is around regulation and the regulatory burden, and very much a call there, not so much to deregulate or to take away regulation, but to get a better balance in terms of regulation. So definitely looking to consumer protection, but also looking to innovation. And insofar as EU policies, and there have been a lot of them in different acts, insofar as they stifle experimentation or, prevent or cost a lot in terms of compliance, is there a better balance that can be gotten to? So that fertile environment for innovation, that piece around regulation, the piece around capital markets and unlocking private funding, all of that, as Imelda pointed to, appeared in the Draghi report, elements of it appeared in the Loretta report. The Commission have taken up the baton now in terms of the competitiveness agenda that they've put forward. So in that, we see reference to simplifying the regulatory environment, the single market benefits, savings and investment union. But I think, again, to what you pointed to, coordination and how they do that and bringing that together is going to be key there. And some of that agenda, when you look through it, it's old-fashioned in some ways. It's structural reform. It's elements of labour market reforms. It's element of product market reforms. And the new piece, and kind of, as economists, which we're thinking about now in terms of productivity going forward, those old pieces, and we'll have the research from the IMF and everyone else that shows you have better product markets, you have better labour markets, it'll boost your growth potential. And the other side then is the new tech and the innovation and the emergence there, and AI and research we would have done in EY, IMF would have done, and so on, shows that there is potential for a productivity boost coming from those technologies. And generally, the research is showing the wider it is spread, the wider the adoption, the more the benefit to it. And this, again, then that creates issues if we're going to have a world which becomes more regional and less globalized in that sense. So we're at a point now where we have kind of those structural reform dimensions, that tech dimension, potentially providing a boost and support to the global economy and to growth and to our own economies, at the same time as we have some stepping back, some retrenchment around globalization, or certainly the golden era of globalization we've moved away from that. So I think they're probably, from a business perspective and from an economy perspective, the key things that we're thinking about at the moment, to that point around economies grow through the demographic component, the labour component, and through the productivity component. So that productivity component in particular, the one we're thinking of. So I'll stop.
Thank you. It's so great. I used to run a seminar on Thursday evenings at back in the law school with junks coming in, and one of the students' pieces of feedback was that I love Thursday evenings because we got a kind of a brain bomb in the room. That's what I feel like. This is marvellous. But so over to you, Paul. No pressure.
No, it's good to be here. So I feel a bit of a fake as an alumni, though, because I was, my degrees are in the 80s, and that's from the Faculty of Commerce on the campus, right? And if you know anyone from commerce in the 80s, that's a different ball game to the kind of nice and well-behaved people I'm seeing here and all the rankings. But that's another story. So what I want to do is, you've been getting a lot of what I call realism here. So what I just want to do is hit you, because if you were in the Faculty of Commerce in the 80s, you would have been hit with general equilibrium theory, and I'm going to hit you with that. So I'm going to give you a theoretical framework, and then I'm going to hit you with the UN stuff, which is a little bit of dreaming or idealism. And then we'll come back to the realities and what's really happening, right? So theoretically, you probably don't know this, but there's a thing called the first welfare theorem in economics, right? And it talks about production frontiers, production possibility frontiers, global ones, right? And what basically says, for Pareto optimality, free movement of goods and services and tech and people, you can allocate resources in those sort of movements, like absolutely free, you'll hit your production possibilities. But from the lawyer's perspective, what's really interesting about the first welfare theorem is that you can be maybe what Donald Trump wants to be, right? You can be the world dictator with benevolency and full knowledge and communism, and you can allocate these resources perfectly and you can hit your production possibility frontiers, right? Or you can take a decentralized situation where there's many nation states, have really powerful regulation and competition, and make sure you get to those bliss points as well. That's your choice. Be decentralized or be completely centralized. The world we're in is in the middle, unfortunately, right? The other thing, second welfare theorem, about equity. What it says is you can be on this production possibility frontier, but you can decide globally and nationally whether you want to achieve that with inequality or equality. So if you want a lot of rich people, a few rich people, a lot of poor people, that's fine. That's your choice. You can redistribute assets the way you want, right? So it treated asset allocation and ownership as a bit exogenous. You inherit it from a war. But you can, if you want to tax and spend, redistribute it. It didn't say it was endogenous to growth or anything like that, which could be interesting, which it is. And then on sustainability, let's create the third welfare theorem, which doesn't exist actually, but I'm creating it now. Obviously, you might think using nature as a source and starting to charge for it, and then using nature as a sink with emissions and charging for it would be cost to business and would limit your growth, right? But if you actually know anything about resources, exhaustible resources, or finite or infinite resources, what you'll realize is that you can keep the stock in the sea, but what you care about is the present discounted value of profits, preserving the optimal level of fish or timber or anything like this, is actually a good policy, right? Running out of that would not be a good idea, right? And the same even from using oil, peak oil, moving to renewable energies. If that's done properly, regulated, charged properly, again, you don't actually need to interfere with your production possibility frontiers, right? So what all that says, unfortunately for humanity, is that just like maybe Sweden or something, we could hit all of these standards of living, like GDP per capita or all the labor productivity things, and it's kind of our choice between policy, innovation, and behavior, where we want equity and sustainability or not, whether we care about future generations or not, right? And I think that's a good message, right? Because that means that you shouldn't be afraid to set up in both national and regional and global institutions that try to regulate and try to induce equity or sustainability. Why not, right? If we think there's a broader preference to have, good standard of living, to be healthy, a healthy planet, and so on, right? So that's just one thing, just to remind people. The second thing is why. So Imelda did a great job on Professor Maher, I should say, on the, suddenly bring us into this world where obviously we haven't really got to a decentralized world where we have that perfect flow of things, and they do need to be regulated, and we do need institutions and stuff, right? But when you kind of think about it, why we have these interstate rules is that what we're trying to say to countries, and it really benefits the smaller countries, having these rules, is that, look, when we try to do something, like lower tariffs, it'd be nice if you lower tariffs, and if we want fair trade, it'd be nice if you have trade, and let's have a legal agreement. Let's put it into a treaty, let's sign it, and let's obey it and have disputes. So that's the way it's done. So that's why we have the things that were described, that they're imperfect, but it's very interesting to see why we have the WTO. And then let's talk about the Summit of the Future, right? So what's really interesting about the first time we've ever had an interstate global governance on tech is this Global Digital Compact that was signed in September just a few months ago, right? And the one thing, so we're on a common ground here, and even at the World Government Summit in Dubai that Elon Musk gave a talk to, it was really interesting how all the tech guys were telling governments, we could run your government, listen, build the data centers, please do that, that's a bit costly for us, and all this data you're collecting is not that interoperable or usable, so if you could kindly, with taxpayers' money, tidy all that up, that would be very nice. And of course you don't have the staff, the IT people to innovate on digital assets, to run digital infrastructures, to have digital public goods, a digital public infrastructure. That's a joke. I mean, that has to be given to the private, right? No, basically, and that's what you're saying. No, that honestly, we have a real problem here in that, you know, it's one thing talking about labour and capital and rules of investment and all this sort of stuff, but we've got to be the same with tech. We've got to be really, really careful about this, right? And there is no reason why, and we said this in Nairobi, it was a consultation on the Summit of the Future, because honestly, that document was, there's two choices. One is the government basically gives it to the private sector and regulates them for good outcomes. Or the other option is you keep it in the public good. You keep it in the state. And you have to know what you keep in the state and what you release as services and what you regulate. And that tension is somehow, when it comes, just so many of us, I guess, are just what we can't program, we don't understand algorithms, we kind of go, how could the public sector run this? You know what I mean, idea, right? So this kind of tech attack on the state is kind of interesting, right? And my response would be to it is to invest heavily in young people so that they can have a career in public service, but that actually they can be tech innovators and disruptors, but they're for the public good. They're not for the private. Just like you have lawyers for the public good and lawyers for the private, or and so on, right? So that's another topic. So just moving forward a bit, the last thing I want to say, though, is that the one thing theory didn't say, and the struggles that we've been having with asymmetric regulatory structures and could Europe discipline the world, is it could maybe really have a balanced multipolarity where we kind of, easier if that ASEAN could deal with an African Union, European Union, American Union, sure Canada should join, why not, you know, the whole lot, they can create their own Americas. The thing that we have to be honest about is that with globalization, a lot of global supply chains are formed into what we call oligopolies, or what's called natural oligopolies, right? So the idea is that we have maybe 2 or 3 dominant companies in each of the global products and services that have evolved, and there's theories why that happens. And we also have particular, what I call enabling industries like logistics, distribution, lawyers, legal services, insurance, etc., who supply these global supply chains. But in reality, these global supply chains are monopolistic. They're kind of restricting output to get a higher price. They are exploiting inequality to lower costs, so they go to countries with lower social protection. They are exploiting the environment as a source and a sink to actually do what they're going to do. And they are the epicenters of what I would call the opposite to having sustainable development, right? So what that sort of means is that we do really have to think about, you can think of it as ESG on global supply chains, but we do have to think about how we put in the regulatory structures that you do business, compete, but don't do it knowingly that you exploit people and exploit nature. That's just not on, basically, right? It's just, you know, I don't think that's the core of any business, right? So you've got to do quite the opposite. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know how they live with nature and with people. So I often say if an alien came down and was just questioning me, you know, God, fragile person, you know, like you're living on this water that's older than the sun itself and it's finite, and like, why don't you make sure that's completely purified and good and available? And you need oxygen, and the ocean gives you 50% of the air you breathe, so what are you doing with your marine protected areas? And then when you look at the clothes you wear, so you were actually not even aware of sustenance and what gives us life. We just really don't understand fully how we coexist with nature and how we coexist with other people on this planet, which is quite surprising. It's a failure in our schooling, in our training, and of course the poor companies, SMEs, doing double materialization and saying, well, how do you affect biodiversity? And I mean, where do you start, right? But you should know this immediately. It should be on the top of your tongue, because this is what you've learned in school. This is how you've operated in life. Okay, that's a diversion. So there was another point that I've kind of forgotten. So what am I? So last point. So one thing we've done with UNIDO, it's called a Capabilities for the Future Hub. We're going to try and organize stakeholders into global supply chains, right, to go for inclusive and sustainable development. And the benefit to a coordinating industrial policy across the supply chains of member states is that they are facing regulatory uncertainties, asymmetric regulatory structures, so they have to really work together on this, right? Tariff structures. The tariff structures are, like if you look at Ireland, there was a paper, Susi, a couple of weeks ago using Eurostat, looking at every SME and every multinational exporter, just looking at are they an intermediate good, what supply chain are they on, etc. God help us working out tariffs and response to tariffs. You're a genius if you know the impacts of these tariffs and retaliations because they're so complex, the supply chains, right? But what it means, though, is that, you know, legal certainty, having communications and internet and tech certainty, all of this along global supply chains could be very useful. And particularly if you just build in knowledge of how you're affecting society, environment, is, you know, because that's a good thing to do. So there is another cut. So you are putting the regional cut. I actually think the world has organized itself around global supply chains. And that's really where the companies and the academics and the lawyers and the logistic companies are interacting. And it's actually quite neat when you put it into an AI and you look at who's there. And you could actually say that's our new multilateralism. That's really where we have to bring in the rules and the agreements, and not just between governments, but actually between the stakeholders on the supply chain. And to say, for your good and for the good of generating money and prosperity, we've got to be resilient to all these, you know, environmental shocks. The climate is fighting back. It's killing your assets, and the insurance company won't insure your assets. Now you have a problem. Right? So it's not like you can just use the environment anymore. You've got to realize how to be resilient to those shocks. Geopolitics is fighting back. You've allowed rapid global inequality and poverty, and now they're basically attacking your global supply chains. Again, you've got to be able to cope with this, right? So there is a way, not on a regional basis by country, but I think in global supply chains, it's probably behind the brick road a little bit with China, there's a way of understanding who's mutually dependent and who would really get into a deal and a legal agreement, and who could do the things that you want to do, but also for what I want to do, which is about equity and sustainability and efficiency going together.
Which I would want as well. Sustainability I would be in favour of. Thank you, Paul. That's great. I think first let's give a round of applause to our panellists.